The inheritance did not feel like a gift, it felt like a quarantine. The farmhouse sat at the absolute center of 200 acres of dead, rotting corn. The stalks were completely desiccated, bleached to a sickly bone white by the late autumn sun. They did not sway. The air out here was heavy and entirely stagnant, holding the suffocating smell of dry earth and decaying vegetation against the siding of the house. I stood at the kitchen sink, letting the cold tap water run over my hands, staring out the window. The scarecrow was exactly where it had been for the last 4 days, anchored in the dead center of the field. Calling it a scarecrow was a failure of language. It was an effigy. The spine and shoulders were welded from thick, rusted wrought-iron rebar. Over this metallic skeleton, someone, my grandfather, presumably, had tightly stretched and stitched large panels of dried, cured animal hide. The leather was black with age and weather, the thick wire sutures holding the skin together clearly visible even from the house. A heavy, coarse burlap sack was pulled tight over the iron head, secured at the neck with a loop of barbed wire. But the detail that lodged like a cold splinter in my mind was the restraint. The effigy's arms were spread wide, but they were not simply tied to the wooden crossbeam. They were bound. Thick, heavy industrial logging chains were wrapped tightly around its wrists and bolted directly through the thick oak post. You do not chain a scarecrow to keep it from falling over. You chain it to keep it from leaving. Every evening since I arrived, I had watched it from this window. Its burlap face was always turned rigidly away from the house, aimed perfectly dead center at the dense, black tree line bordering the far edge of the property. It was a sentinel. It was standing guard. I turned off the tap, the water pressure died. I reached for a dish towel, keeping my eyes fixed on the distant iron cross in the field. The sun was dipping below the horizon, bleeding a bruised, dark purple light across the dead corn. I blinked, rubbing the exhaustion from my eyes with the coarse cotton towel. When I lowered my hands and looked back through the glass, the geometry of the field had changed. My breath caught in my throat, a sudden rigid paralysis seizing my chest. The effigy was no longer facing the woods. It had rotated a full 180 degrees. The blank, featureless burlap sack was now pointed directly at the kitchen window, directly at me. I leaned closer to the glass, my mind frantically trying to rationalize the physics. The thick oak post was still anchored firmly in the soil, but the heavy iron rebar shoulders had violently twisted. The logging chains were broken. Thick, rusted links hung vertically from the crossbeam, terminating in jagged, snapped edges that hovered inches above the dirt. The force required to shear that metal was astronomical, yet the dead corn stalks surrounding the post were perfectly undisturbed. A cold, chemical dread flooded my veins. The scarecrow had not turned around to threaten me. It had turned its back on the woods. It had broken its chains to retreat. Driven by a sickening, primitive instinct, I shifted my focus past the rusted iron of the effigy, staring deep into the absolute black of the distant tree line it had been guarding. At the very edge of the woods, where the dead corn met the shadow of the pines, a massive, pale, multi-limbed shape was slowly, meticulously pulling itself out of the dark and sliding silently into the field. I stepped back from the sink. My hand moved blindly, finding the brass latch of the kitchen window and snapping it shut. The metal was freezing against my palm. The pale mass at the edge of the tree line did not stand up. It moved low to the ground, its multiple limbs pulling its heavy bulk forward with a terrifying, liquid smoothness. As it breached the perimeter of the field, the bone-white stalks of dead corn were simply crushed flat beneath its weight. A slow, expanding wake of flattened vegetation began to carve its way through the dense, standing stalks. It was heading exactly toward the center, toward the wooden post. I reached blindly for the wall switch and killed the overhead kitchen light. The sudden darkness inside the house turned the windowpane from a reflection back into a lens. Outside, the bruised purple of the twilight had died, replaced by the harsh, silver geometry of the rising moon. I pressed my shoulder against the wall beside the window frame, keeping my silhouette hidden, and watched the wake crawl through the corn. The path of crushed stalks reached the absolute center of the field. It stopped directly at the base of the thick oak post. The iron scarecrow was gone. The heavy broken logging chains dangled empty in the moonlight. The rusted rebar spine, the stitched animal hides, the burlap sack, the entire effigy had vanished from the crossbeam. A suffocating tightness clamped down on my ribs. The Scarecrow hadn't just broken its chains to look at the house. It had broken them to flee. My eyes frantically scanned the silver surface of the dead corn. Nothing stood above the stalks. The pale mass was hidden somewhere in the crushed center, and the iron sentinel was missing. The property was a static, unmoving photograph of rural desolation. Then a massive, solid shadow eclipsed the moonlight spilling across the kitchen floor. The illumination from the window had been physically blocked. I slowly turned my head, my cervical vertebrae feeling like ground glass, and looked directly at the windowpane beside my shoulder. The Scarecrow was on my back porch. It was pressed completely flat against the exterior of the kitchen window. The crude, wire-stitched animal hides of its chest were pushed flush against the glass. The heavy iron rebar of its arms was splayed wide across the frame, gripping the wooden siding. Its burlap head was angled downward, pressed so hard against the pane that the coarse fabric flattened against the barrier. It was not attacking the house. Its posture was violently, rigidly defensive. It was cowering against the glass, trying to merge with the architecture, its form trembling with a heavy, mechanical vibration. It was desperate to hide from the massive, pale, multi-jointed hand that was slowly reaching up over the edge of the wooden porch boards directly behind it. The pale hand crested the edge of the porch. It was impossibly wide, the flesh a sickly, luminescent white under the moon. The skin was completely smooth, devoid of pores, veins, or blemishes, gripping the wooden floorboards with thick, multi-jointed fingers. The iron scarecrow pressed itself harder against the windowpane. I could see the rusted wire sutures holding its leather chest together pulled absolutely taut, the coarse animal hide trembling with the strain of its mechanical terror. A second pale hand reached up from the dark. It bypassed the porch railing entirely and clamped directly onto the Scarecrow's shoulder. There was no struggle, the physical disparity was absolute. The pale digits dug deeply into the thick, cured leather. With a slow, horrifyingly fluid motion, the hands pulled outward. The thick wire sutures binding the Scarecrow's chest simply parted. The heavy iron rebar beneath the leather warped and bent, yielding under the pressure like soft copper. The pale creature was systematically peeling the effigy. I watched, paralyzed behind the cold glass, as the heavy black hides were stripped entirely away from the metal skeleton. The bare, rusted iron cross collapsed, slipping down the glass and dropping out of my line of sight. The pale mass rose fully into the window frame. It had no face, no distinct anatomy, just a towering, shifting column of wet, dense white tissue. Slowly, it bent down and gathered the discarded, torn animal hides from the porch boards. It began to drape the heavy, rotting leather over its own pale form, sliding its shifting limbs into the empty sleeves, and finally pulling the coarse burlap sack over its featureless peak. It was putting on the clothes, it was replacing the iron. But the hides were decades old. As the massive, expanding entity forced its biology inside, the rotting leather split. The remaining wire stitches tore completely through the brittle, desiccated skin. The disguise was ruined, far too decayed and fragile to contain the immense pressure of the pale tissue beneath it. The entity stopped moving. The burlap sack slowly rotated toward the kitchen window. It leaned forward until the coarse fabric pressed against the exterior glass, mere inches from my face. Through the frayed, empty eye holes of the burlap, a localized patch of wet, pale tissue pushed forward, flattening wetly against the pane. The frost on the window began to melt in a perfect, rapid circle from the radiating heat of its body. The architecture of my inheritance finally clicked into place. The sickening truth of the dead corn, the heavy logging chains, the isolation. My grandfather had not left me a farm, he had left me as a rotation. The iron sentinel was never a scarecrow, it was a decoy. It was a temporary, stitched-together offering left chained in the center of the dead field to keep the pale thing in the woods satisfied. But leather rots, weather destroys. The decoy had finally degraded beyond use. The entity raised one long, pale finger and slowly traced the outline of my silhouette on the outside of the glass. It didn't want the iron, it just wanted the hide. And as I looked down at the warm, seamless, living skin of my own trembling hands, I realized exactly what I had been lured here to replace.